America didn't elect a strongman by accident. It watched a political reality show, laughed at the vulgarity, ignored the warning labels, and then woke up shocked when the joke moved into the Oval Office. Inside the con that helped Trump win is not a story about one loud man with a red tie. It's about a system that sold rage as patriotism, lies as strength, and chaos as authentic leadership. Billionaires funded it, politicians normalized it, media monetized it, and fear sealed the deal. This wasn't a campaign. It was a long, cynical hustle, and we all paid the price. For decades, American conservatism sold itself as a moral upgrade. Discipline, responsibility, respect for the law. Work hard, play by the rules, accept consequences. It sounded stern, serious, almost puritanical. And it worked because myths only survive when they feel familiar. But beneath the sermon was a loophole so large you could drive a corporate jet through it. Discipline was always meant for other people. The working poor were lectured about personal responsibility while Wall Street received bailouts without handcuffs. Inner cities were flooded with police and prisons, while boardrooms were flooded with bonuses after financial collapse. When a single mother missed a welfare form, she was a moral failure. When banks laundered money, crashed the global economy, and wiped out pensions, they were too big to fail. Conservative virtue was never about restraint, it was about hierarchy. Law and order became the slogan, but enforcement followed wealth, not principle. Iran-Contra ended without real accountability. The architects of torture after the 11th of September published memoirs and landed book deals instead of indictments. George W. Bush launched a war on false pretenses that killed hundreds of thousands and destabilized an entire region, yet no conservative movement demanded prison. Apparently, accountability was only sacred when it could be weaponized downward. Then came Donald Trump, a man who did not even pretend to embody conservative morality. Serial infidelity, open corruption, casual contempt for the Constitution, public admiration for dictators. And here is the uncomfortable truth. He did not break conservative values, he tested them, and they collapsed instantly. The same politicians who spent years moralizing about character suddenly discovered a new theology. Winning absolves everything. Evangelical leaders who once condemned Bill Clinton for private behavior declared Trump chosen. The party that preached fiscal discipline exploded the deficit with tax cuts for the ultra-wealthy. The movement that claimed to worship the rule of law rallied behind a man who treated judges, prosecutors, and juries as enemies to be punished. This was not hypocrisy by accident. It was hypocrisy as infrastructure. Conservative virtue functioned as a branding strategy, not a governing philosophy. Its purpose was to justify inequality, not restrain power. Once Trump proved that voters would accept cruelty without coherence and loyalty without law, the mask became unnecessary. The base was told that migrants were criminals, teachers were groomers, journalists were enemies, and elections were rigged. Fear replaced policy, outrage replaced argument. Meanwhile, corporations received deregulation, donors received tax shelters, and executives received protection. Discipline never disappeared. It was simply redirected at protesters, voters, minorities, and anyone inconvenient. Trump succeeded because he understood the quiet part. The rules were never meant to apply upward. He said it out loud, acted it out, and dared the system to stop him. It did not, because it could not. A movement built on immunity for the powerful cannot suddenly rediscover virtue when the powerful stop pretending. Conservative morality was not stolen, it was exposed. And once exposed, it could no longer hide behind sermons about character while cashing checks written in chaos. The anger that powered Trump did not come from nowhere. It was manufactured, fermented, and carefully ignored for 40 years. Ronald Reagan did not merely change tax policy. He rewired the American story. He told working people that if the rich were freed from restraint, prosperity would rain down on everyone else. It sounded optimistic. It was a fairy tale with a corporate sponsor. Supply-side economics promised growth through generosity toward the top. What it delivered was extraction. Wages flatlined while productivity soared. From the early 1980s onward, American workers produced more wealth than any generation before them, yet took home a shrinking share of it. Meanwhile, the cost of housing exploded, healthcare metastasized into a profit engine, and college transformed from a ladder into a lifelong debt sentence. This was not an accident. It was design. Unions were crushed, not because they were inefficient, but because they gave workers leverage. Regulations were dismantled, not because they failed, but because they interfered with profit. Taxes on capital were slashed while payroll taxes quietly shouldered the burden. Over time, roughly $50 trillion flowed upward from labor to the investor class. That transfer built yachts, not stability. When people began to feel the pain, conservatism did not correct course. It changed the target. Immigrants were blamed for stagnant wages. Black communities were blamed for crime. Feminism was blamed for male anxiety. Government was blamed for problems caused by deregulation. Rage needed direction, and facts were inconvenient. By the time Trump arrived, the country was primed. Millions of Americans were working harder for less security, drowning in debt, watching their towns hollow out while executives cashed stock options. They knew something was wrong. They were never told what. Trump offered a villain list instead of an explanation. He did not talk about capital concentration or monopoly power. He talked about walls, enemies, and betrayal. It felt honest because it was loud. Here's the brilliance and the cruelty of the Reagan-era legacy. It separated economic suffering from economic causes. People were angry, but the system trained them to aim sideways. Trump simply pointed louder. He told voters the system was rigged, which was true. He just lied about who rigged it. Billionaires funded his rise because chaos is cheap. Anger distracted voters from balance sheets. Tax cuts were passed under the cover of culture war smoke. While supporters argued about flags and pronouns, wealth quietly consolidated. Rage became the product. Elections became the delivery system, and democracy became collateral damage. Trump did not create economic despair. He franchised it. He wrapped decades of broken promises in nationalist language and sold it as rebellion. The tragedy is not that people believed him. The tragedy is that they were never given the truth in the first place. Reagan planted the bomb. Trump lit the fuse, and the explosion was not ideological. It was emotional, economic, and entirely predictable. Every authoritarian movement eventually stops arguing and starts intimidating. American conservatism crossed that line quietly, then all at once. The moment loyalty became more valuable than legality, fear replaced ideology as the glue holding the party together. Donald Trump did not invent this tactic. He perfected it, weaponized it, and turned it into a governing strategy. Publicly, Republican leaders still speak the language of freedom. Privately, many admit they are terrified. Former allies disappear overnight, not because they were wrong, but because they hesitated. A single vote, a single sentence, acknowledging reality, is enough to trigger political execution. Primary challenges appear instantly. Fundraising evaporates, threats flood inboxes, security details quietly increase. This is not metaphorical fear, it is operational fear. Mitt Romney described colleagues who wanted to vote to convict Trump, but changed their minds after receiving threats against their families. Joe Walsh has said out loud what many whisper: the party is no longer driven by belief, but by survival instinct. Members do not ask what is legal. They ask what will keep them alive politically, financially, sometimes physically. Trump understood something essential. Laws only matter if people are willing to enforce them. Courts only function if leaders respect outcomes. Once fear enters the equation, law becomes optional. Prosecutors become enemies. Judges become targets. Investigators become traitors. Trump framed accountability as persecution and turned the machinery of grievance into a shield. The examples are concrete. Election officials who certified results received death threats. Federal judges ruling against Trump required protection. Lawmakers who acknowledged the election was legitimate were labeled traitors. Meanwhile, Trump openly promised retribution, naming enemies, floating prosecutions, celebrating punishment. This was not rhetoric drift, it was signaling. Fear works because it is efficient. You do not need policy coherence when intimidation does the organizing. You do not need ideology when obedience is enforced socially and digitally. Online mobs do the work institutions once did. Loyalty tests replace debates. Silence becomes the safest vote. What makes this moment uniquely dangerous is normalization. Threats are treated as background noise. Violence is reframed as passion. January 6th becomes a misunderstanding. Lone actors radicalized by constant escalation are dismissed as anomalies, while the environment that produced them remains untouched. Trumpism thrives on this atmosphere. A party that cannot tolerate dissent becomes brittle, not strong. Every authoritarian system eventually consumes its own. The most obedient today become the first casualties tomorrow. Fear does not stabilize power. It accelerates collapse. The conservative movement once claimed to revere the Constitution. Now it treats it as a suggestion. The rule of law has been replaced by the rule of proximity to the leader. Protection flows upward, punishment flows outward. This is not conservatism. It is a loyalty economy. Trump did not conquer the party with ideas. He conquered it by making resistance more painful than submission. When enough people choose silence to avoid consequences, truth disappears without a fight. That is how fear governs, quietly, efficiently, until it does not. Every strongman story includes the same supporting cast, wealthy patrons who believe they are smarter than history. They tell themselves they are not endorsing authoritarianism, only leveraging it. They insist they can ride the tiger without being eaten. American billionaires made that bet with Donald Trump. And like every oligarch before them, they mistook proximity for control. The logic sounded sophisticated. Trump was crude, chaotic, undisciplined, but useful. He could cut taxes, crush regulations, weaken labor, and stack courts. In return, donors would tolerate the noise. Democracy, they assumed, was durable enough to survive a little stress. The market would correct excess. Institutions would restrain impulse. This was arrogance disguised as pragmatism. The results were immediate and measurable. Corporate tax rates collapsed. Environmental rules vanished. Antitrust enforcement fell asleep. Stock buybacks exploded. Executive compensation surged while wages stagnated. The donor class got exactly what it paid for, at least at first. Chaos turned out to be profitable. What they did not anticipate was scale. Trump did not want to be managed. He wanted dominance. He did not treat donors as partners. He treated them as fuel. Loyalty was expected. Silence was rewarded. Criticism triggered retaliation. The same state power once used to protect capital was now openly repurposed to punish enemies. History offers a warning label, and it is not subtle. Fritz Thyssen, the German steel magnate, believed Adolf Hitler could be controlled. He funded him, promoted him, opened doors for him. Once Hitler consolidated power, Thyssen discovered that wealth buys access, not safety. He fled. Others were not so lucky. Authoritarians do not share power. They consume it. American elites repeated the same mistake, convinced themselves that this time was different. They underestimated how quickly fear travels once legitimized from the top. They underestimated how fast institutions erode when leaders stop pretending to respect them. They underestimated how disposable they would become once obedience mattered more than money. Trump showed his hand clearly. He attacked corporations that displeased him. He threatened media owners. He promised revenge against donors who defected. He normalized the idea that state power exists to settle personal scores. This was not theoretical. It was campaign messaging. The billionaire class remained largely silent. Silence became complicity. Criticism risked retaliation. Speaking out threatened stock prices, contracts, access. It felt safer to wait it out, to assume this was temporary. That assumption is always wrong. Authoritarian movements thrive when economic elites prioritize short-term gain over systemic stability. They believe they can exit before consequences arrive. They forget that collapsing democracies do not offer clean exits. Capital cannot hedge against chaos forever. Markets depend on trust. Trust depends on law. Law cannot survive when loyalty replaces legitimacy. Trump did not need to nationalize industries to control them. He only needed uncertainty, fear of investigation, fear of regulatory whiplash, fear of becoming the next target. The message was simple: comply or pay. The tragedy is not that billionaires miscalculated. It is that they believed they were exempt from the outcome. Riding the tiger feels exhilarating until it turns, and by the time it does, jumping off is no longer an option. There is a comforting lie Americans love to tell themselves in moments like this, that things will somehow balance out, that institutions will self-correct, that extremes exhaust themselves. History laughs at that fantasy. Democracy does not drift into safety. It moves forward because people push it, or it collapses because people hesitate. What happens next is not neutral. It never was. The United States is no longer debating policy preferences. This is not about marginal tax rates or regulatory philosophy. It is a binary choice between a constitutional republic governed by law and a personalized system of power governed by loyalty, fear, and vengeance. Pretending otherwise is not moderation. It is surrender with better branding. Authoritarian movements survive on passivity. They do not require majority support. They require exhaustion, confusion, and the quiet belief that resistance is pointless. Trumpism feeds on that belief. It tells citizens that courts are corrupt, elections are fake, facts are negotiable, and violence is understandable. Once people stop trusting shared reality, the loudest liar wins by default. This is why the phrase "both sides" has become so dangerous. Neutrality in the face of democratic erosion does not preserve stability. It accelerates collapse. Every democracy that failed did so with a large population convinced the crisis was exaggerated. By the time the consequences felt real, options were gone. Look around. Election workers resigning after threats, judges requiring security, school boards turning into battlegrounds, politicians openly promising retribution, federal power discussed as a weapon, not a responsibility. These are not theoretical warning signs. They are symptoms. The question is not whether Americans agree on everything. They never have. The question is whether disagreement still operates inside shared rules. Once a movement decides it will only accept outcomes where it wins, democracy becomes a performance, not a system. Voting turns ceremonial. Law turns selective. Citizenship turns conditional. There is another lie worth discarding, that saving democracy requires ideological purity. It does not. It requires coalitions. Progressives, moderates, disillusioned, conservatives, independents, business leaders who still believe contracts matter, religious communities that understand freedom cannot survive coercion. Democracies endure through alliances, not unanimity. Courage matters more than messaging. Courts must be defended even when rulings disappoint. Journalists must be protected even when coverage irritates. Protests must remain lawful but relentless. Participation must be boring, persistent, and local. Democracy is not saved by viral moments. It survives through repetition. The exit option always tempts the privileged. Move, withdraw, wait it out. History shows how that ends. When democracies fall, escape narrows quickly. Authoritarian systems do not respect late conversions. Silence never buys permanent safety. This moment demands clarity. You cannot half oppose authoritarianism. You cannot delay defense of law until after the next election cycle. You cannot outsource courage to institutions while undermining them rhetorically. The cost of democracy is engagement. The cost of apathy is irreversible. Trump did not create this crossroads. He revealed it. One path leads toward accountability, pluralism, and uncomfortable debate. The other leads toward submission dressed up as order. Choosing neither is still a choice. Democracy or exit. The clock is running.